at the moment, democracy is kidnapped by individuals like Donald Trump, who can make false, empirically false statements like simultaneously lowering taxes and lowering the deficit. Those individuals are able to capture the democratic process and force others into making equally false statements, which reduce the possibility of good and sustainable economic policy. We want to change that on OG today. What is our policy? Firstly, we will have a panel of economic experts that broadly represent varying views. So we'll have Keynesians, we'll have behavioral economists, we'll probably put in a few Austrians as well that will evaluate whether claims are really true, whether they will lead to whether policies will lead to the things which they claim they will lead to. So it's still fine to make a value judgment, like we will have more redistribution. But if you want to claim that also leads to a far higher level of economic growth in the country, that is something that has to be proven to that panel. The decision will be made by consensus of those economists. We also point out in this that no, thank you. If politicians and political parties continue putting forward policies that were not approved, we will not allow them to stand in elections. I think that policy is fairly clear. Legitimacy. We point out that democracy does not have an intrinsic value. It has value only to the extent it allows people to make good decisions and lead to good outcomes. How do we know this? Because there are already in the status quo unelected bodies that are a check on democracy. For instance, central banks are largely unelected. They are governors that are appointed once in 5 or 7 years by parliaments, but they are largely independent in setting their interest rates or monetary policies. Why? Because if they weren't able to do so, what will happen is probably politicians would just jack up interest rates shortly before elections. So we already restrict democracy. Courts are similar to this, especially high legislative bodies like Supreme Courts or constitutional courts. But secondly, we point out that democracy has value to the extent it allows individuals to make an informed decision. If that decision is not informed, then their preferences aren't accurate. No, thank you. Their preferences aren't accurately cared for at a moment when those preferences are skewed, i.e. people vote for something. Because usually people vote for outcomes rather than specific policies. When those outcomes do not accrue, we would argue that individuals have not made an informed decision and their preferences are hence not accurately allocated. So to the extent democracy is about allocating preferences, you get more of that on our side of the house. Why is this policy necessary? Firstly on this, we point out that economics, the dismal science, is incredibly complicated. It requires a good understanding of statistics in order to predict what a likely result of a policy will be. It also requires understanding how different actors in the economy rely on. GDP is a very complicated statistical measure that is very difficult for a lot of individuals to understand. Obviously, panels of trained economists aren't perfect in this as well, but we would argue, as someone who studied economics for 15 or 20 years, is probably far more likely to have a grasp of what policies will lead to. Secondly, we point out that a lot of voters simply do not have a large incentive to get informed on economics. As I pointed out, it is incredibly complicated. But when you have one vote in 50 million voters, then it's likely that the amount of time it will take you to study a possible decision is incredibly long, which means a lot of individuals choose not to study economics or the likely impacts of an economic policy. But thirdly, as a result of the fact that plenty of people do realize they don't fully understand economics, they usually pick the policies that sound most common sense-ish to them. Often those policies aren't things which are necessarily true. Outsourcing may very well be good for the American poor by providing a cheaper product, but that's something that is not obvious for a lot of individuals. Fourthly, to an extent there is fact-checking. It also requires a large degree of time for people to assess, but it also requires them to actually be incentivized to fact-check. A lot of individuals simply do not have a sufficient amount of time to get necessarily informed on politics. So, what does our policy lead to benefits overall? Well, firstly, and obviously, no thank you, we get less policies based on blatant lies, like Trump's claims on simultaneously lowering the debt, lowering the deficit, and lowering taxes. You don't get mega claims on lowering debt by Mitt Romney either. But we point out that these policies are probably the most likely to harm the poorest, who are most likely to be lied about. Secondly, we point out that this changes the incentive for political parties. In the status quo, what they usually do is make outlandish statements because those get a lot of attention. Now they can't do that because they will be forced to, because they will be prevented from standing in elections. Why is this especially important? When parties make outlandish statements, other parties are forced to do that as well because those outlandish statements garner a lot of attention. So because Rick Santorum had ludicrous claims on taxes, relatively sensible Republicans in the 2012 election, like Mitt Romney, were also forced to make such statements on lowering of taxes. Why is this important? Because it leads to because when you remove that incentive for any of the politicians, you get less of those claims and better thought out economic policy, especially on this. When parties in the status quo only engage a few economists, and usually ones that pander to their views, to prepare possible economic policies for elections, on our side of the house, we have an incentive to engage relatively centrist economists and engage a lot of people in order to make an informed decision. That is the benefit. Yeah.
In the 1920s and 1910s, most economists believed that colonialism was the best vehicle for economic development. What makes you so sure of the current international consensus?
I mean, probably a lot of people thought colonialism was the best for economic development at that time as well. So I'm not necessarily sure you get that benefit on your side of the house. But also, to an extent, it may be difficult to reach a consensus that will only incentivize parties to engage a broader array of economists when preparing their policies. As I already pointed out, we would argue that is beneficial because that's what engages the preferences of most individuals in society anyways. So overall, you get a large race to the bottom as a result of the situation in the status quo, where a lot of parties are forced into making ludicrous claims. But it also changes the tone of the political debate, where people are likely to make radically opposing claims and generally lower the level of public discourse. When they have to make relatively centrist and sensible policies, that's when you're more likely to get overall far more sensible policies, and policies which will be likely to lead to better outcomes when they're implemented afterwards. So overall, democracy is not an intrinsic good. It is only good to an extent it leads to better outcomes. We definitely get those on our side of the house, where policies are more thought out, when policies are more realistic, and when policies are assessed by a broader array of people, rather than pandering to your very narrow far left or far right constituency. I am very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker and call upon the leader of the opposition.
Crooked MDG wants to shut down legitimate debate and discussion. He's running scared, sad. I cannot think of a better policy to play into the hands of Donald Trump than the ones just proposed by the opening government, and that's what we're going to bring you in opening opposition. I'm going to first look at what this does to political debate. I'm secondly going to examine why you shut out legitimate preferences. I'm fourthly going to talk about enforcement. Thirdly, enforcement, and fourthly, some stuff on value judgment. So what does this do to political debate? First of all, to be clear, we actually think the status quo is remarkably efficient at getting relatively good economic outcomes by matching economic policies to roughly what people want. Why do I believe this to be the case? Because every person is an economic expert in the economic affairs of their own life. Everyone is pretty capable of answering the basic question of are you better off or worse off than you were 4 years ago, which means that ultimately if your key constituency is happy, whether that be the middle class, whether that be businesses, whether it be sections of the working population, ultimately those people are people who you can trust to vote the government out and hold the government relatively to accountable if they feel like they're being screwed over. Crucially also, they draw an expert opinion to inform themselves on what the correct economic outlook should be. Why do I think that's true? Because ultimately, the most powerful weapon any political party has is convincing people that broadly they are the guys who can be trusted on the economy, and broadly they're the people who aren't going to risk the livelihoods of individuals. That means there's actually an enormous incentive to cuddle up to expert opinion as much as possible. That's why, for example, in the campaign for Scottish independence, there was a race to be seen as the people with the experts on side, that kind of thing. So ultimately, we think that it's much more likely than they think that people will cuddle towards expert opinions on their side of the house. But why do they wreck debate with the policy they propose? for the relatively obvious reason that compliance with this policy is just too difficult for the vast majority of parties and the vast majority of political candidates. Why do I think that's the case? For 3 reasons. Firstly, because exact compliance with details of economic policy and details of economic principles actually is really bloody expensive, because you need to hire very expensive policy units and do research and do the statistical analysis, ultimately crunch the numbers. Basically what they're doing is making sure that every single candidate running for political office has to set up their own office of budgetary responsibility. We think it's implausible that most parties would be able to do that. Secondly, these parties might just have very legitimate ideological disagreements to mainstream economists. For example, all economists broadly agree on basic principles of utilitarianism. We think it's perfectly legitimate for parties to reflect that, to reject that outright. So ideologically, it's incredibly hard for parties to comply while still maintaining their appeal to particular voters. Thirdly, we tell you parties will be immensely risk-averse when it comes to this policy. They didn't give us an enforcement mechanism, but I assume it's going to be something along the lines of the mechanisms we have for cracking down on electoral compliance under the status quo, which probably means you're going to fine them or ban them from the advertising or shut them out of debates or even kick them off the ballot or something like that. Parties won't want to take that risk, at which point we think they're not going to be able to comply with this policy. So given scarce resources, and given I've just shown that on their side of the House, parties are unable to specify exact economic policy, what exactly do? We think they devote their political capital, quote unquote, to other means, basically, to less specific statements. So they end up actually making more statements like Donald Trump and being vaguer on what exactly they're supporting. They'll say things like, we're going to start winning again, we're going to make better deals, we're generally going to bring back stability and prosperity, that kind of stuff. Why exactly is that so harmful? Firstly, because it's significantly less accountable than the status quo, where parties can at least be specific to some extent. So if you realise a candidate's lied to you, you can vote them out the next time around and people are smart enough to make that judgment. You lose that on your side of the House because meaningful details have never been consented to. They trample on the democratic choice of individuals on their side of the House. But secondly, we tell you that it's harmful, this policy is harmful because it's going to harm sensible centrist parties like the ones they like, much more than it's going to harm Donald Trump. Because the comparative advantage of sensible centrist parties under the status quo is to be able to say, look, Trump is bullshitting, he's not giving you specifics, we're the ones you can trust because we're the ones who have a grasp of the detail. If you remove that advantage over them, it's much more likely that they're going to have to play Trump's game, of which they will definitely lose, as Hillary Clinton has done, as like people like Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio have repeatedly. I've kind of already covered why we shut out legitimate preferences with that analysis, but let's just briefly expand on it. We don't think everyone wants to vote on the economy. We think some people want to vote on the environment, on social policy, on identity, on concepts like freedom. We respect those preferences because they are part of an individual identity, and in a democracy we should respect this. Why are they harmed on their side of the House? Because the kind of small parties who tend to carve out niches lobbying for environmental rights or social rights or like free economic rights, like people like Ron Paul in the US basically, all of those people are the people who are most harmed by that policy because they're the least able to comply for the reasons I already outlined. Let's talk now about how they enforce this policy, because I think they've been remarkably vague on this point, and I don't want to let them get away with it. If anyone tries, if anyone tries to get around this, and we think probably on balance, Donald Trump probably will, he'll probably still tell lies on both sides of the House. What are they going to do to him? Fine him? Edit his campaign statements? Shut him off the airwaves? I mean, if you literally take this policy literally and enforce it as we think they ought to do, then we think ultimately what you're going to do is a situation where the US federal government is repeatedly editing the statements of Donald Trump. I cannot think of anything which would be a better campaign slogan for him than crooked MPG wants to edit my policies. I'll take Owen.
If someone does want to vote for the Green Party, for instance, on the basis of they like environmentalism or they want to vote for it as a pro-principle, don't you think it's better that they know they're voting for those things rather than they're using ludicrous lies like abolishing fractional reserve bank?
The point is the Green Party doesn't get on the ballot in the first place because it's unable to make the basic requirements of your policy. That's the whole point of that argument. So, let's talk finally about judgments. Because given we don't necessarily think objective morality exists, and we think we need to draw upon a plurality of moral views in order to make correct moral judgments, the only good way to do that is democracy, where you aggregate the preferences and work out a consensus moral system. Why exactly is it that this is impossible with a panel of economic experts, and why are there some judgments in economics which are just inherently subjective, basically? The main one we want to touch on here is the balance between those who are living at the moment and those who will live one day in the future. Because when you make an economic decision, you are also making decisions for those who are not yet born. When you choose to cut back on environmental regulation to boost short-term economic growth, or when you choose to borrow more money now knowing future generations will have to pay it back, the trade-off between my obligations to Tom and everyone in this room versus the obligations which I may or may not owe to those who will live 50 to 100 years from now is deeply subjective in and of itself. We have no idea why you give experts the chance to decide on this complex moral decision while never leaving it up to, while never giving individuals a say on this. Ultimately, we don't think they've played ball. They haven't told us the details of this policy, and for that reason alone, crooked MDG is out of this debate.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker and call on
Also, I cannot be recorded for this speech, so we can turn off that camera, please, now. Can you turn off the camera, please? I'm not being recorded for this speech. The person behind, check that it's off.
rightly sceptical about the claims that politicians make. But even if those claims may be factually incorrect, what they have is an enormous value in terms of signalling to the public what sort of general administration that is going to be and what sort of general principles it espouses and believes in. That provides valuable information to individuals, which even if it clashes with what an academic economist might believe, still allows them to make better decisions as to how they should make their vote. 2 points in the speech. First, I'm going to look at how this changes political debate. Secondly, I'm going to look at whether this is fair. Note that on to this first issue. Note that under the status quo, people who want to vote on the basis of the exact estimates of academic economists are able to do so. Individuals who want to be able to make votes on the basis of data are able to look at estimates by independent organisations like the Institute for Fiscal Studies, or indeed governmental organisations tasked with producing estimates of different political parties' likely plans, like the Office for Budget Responsibility in the UK, or the Congressional Budget Organisation in the United States. So that information already exists. But what we include is information for a broader range of voters who are able to gain information from statements which, while technically may be incorrect, are nevertheless important to them. So to use an example, the Australian Labor Party is packed with absolute nutty people who have crazy ideas about economics. So these are the kind of people who have conspiracy theories about the global banking elite and how fractional reserve banking was created to control all of us. Given that many of the party's activists are the people who believe strongly in these views and are going to put it down in that manifesto, we believe it's nevertheless important for these views to get across, because there are a number of very moderate Australians who live within urban centres who, while they might not agree with that, are able to see that they want a party that doesn't support island gulags, that imprison and torture refugees, and furthermore support marriage equality. Shutting out that political debate by telling that activist class that they're not able to be part of that party and communicate a coherent economic policy is disastrous. Why is this the case? Because even if those economic policies are going to be ones that are relatively irrelevant to a given administration, it's likely the case that it would look really bad if you just said, hey, manifesto, economic policy, no comment. So at the point that people within your party strongly believe those views, being able to put them down there and be accorded with views of people who might not be ultimately getting those views implemented, but ultimately communicating broad agreement with principles is important. To use another example, Ron Paul is able to use his support of the gold standard, despite the fact that no academic economist of any repute would support that, in order to gain access to broadly libertarian voters who believe there ought to be more strict controls over the ability of the federal government to trample on the rights of people's freedoms. That's something that he's able to communicate clearly with that economic policy. It might not win over the policy wonks, but what it does at the level people vote is communicate that desire. It communicates a broad principle that people agree with, and given that's what we think that people often vote upon, because people usually aren't high information voters who are going to scrutinise all of these plans. We think being able to signal what kind of administration you're supporting using these policies is a very good idea. How does this change under their side? We believe that politics is going to become much vaguer. So Ted Cruz's tax plan didn't add up, but it nevertheless had a lot of details that allowed voters an insight into the general tax policy that his administration would run when they were able to get that through Congress. He said he was supporting something like a VAT, even though he wasn't willing to call it a VAT in any of the debates, and was supporting reductions in corporate income tax. The exact numbers might have been incorrect, but allowing him to be able to support plausible sounding principles, which sometimes in order to be attractive to conservative voters needed numbers that mightn't have been particularly attractive to them, is much better than the alternative. Michael said, Donald Trump though makes very specific, broad and bold claims. For example, he claims we're going to make America great again, rather than the fact that we're going to make things slightly better, possibly. We nevertheless think that making America great again is quite a vague statement in the sort that will be incentivised by their policy. So Donald Trump is allowed to stand up and say, we lose to China. They're doing all the winning, when are we going to win again? I will make America great. I make the best deals. I've built great structures. I've had a lot of success. That is what is allowed under their side of the house, but a slightly incorrect tax policy made to appeal to a particular ideological base and be able to win support for more broad principles which will actually be implemented by that administration is something that they don't allow. So as a result, you're far more likely to get Trumpian statements of voters who have even less idea of what they're voting for and are able to support closing.
Isn't these kind of vague statements precisely the sort of signalling effect that you want to get on your side of the house?
No, because they don't give voters any information, because you can often identify more specifically which principles people think are important when they propose particular policies, as opposed to when they just say that they want to make a country great or think it's good or they think a particular principle is important. We believe that being able to tie yourself to particular types of voters or tie yourself to particular recommendations of sets of experts is the kind of specificity that makes those principled commitments very clear. Let's now look at what's going to be fair. So Michael says there's going to be no backlash to this issue because it will create barriers for entry for parties that don't already exist. We think there are a broad range of parties who do already exist, who are naturally going to be annoyed about the fact that there's a conspiracy to shut down their views and prevent them from even publishing that information or having it available for voters in the first place. Even if there's an implicit awareness that that might be what that party wants to implement, there's information that voters will never get at the point they're unable to put it on the table. Because note that they're perfectly fine with a government not running a particular policy because it's economically illiterate in a campaign, but then implementing it when it's in government. That's a severe danger that they haven't dealt with and will lead to worse economic policy as a result. Furthermore, we think that many of the preferences of economists aren't reflective of those of the general population as a whole. So it's not just the fact that there's only been a single female economist who's won the Nobel Prize in economics, it's very specific things, like the fact that when economists talk of efficiency, they use it in a very particular sense to mean that there exists a potential trade that could be made to compensate individuals for the negative effects of any particular transaction or policy. That's a very particular meaning, which isn't going to be clear for most people, or indeed is something that economists often view as a value-neutral judgment, even though we think that it implies value judgments. Furthermore, decisions about the discount rate we use when deciding future policy are often very clear to economists because of reasoning that the public might have other principles they believe ought to be factored into those decisions. They shut down legitimate considerations and they make that debate far worse, far more vague, and far less productive.
So George tells us it's very important that people have some form of consent they consent to these policies. I question whether or not you can withdraw consent from the idea that printing money causes inflation. Like, I wonder if the Venezuelans say, like, well, I'm consenting to the idea that printing money doesn't cause inflation, so that means we don't have inflation anymore, right? I feel like the fact that people are hungry, the fact that people don't have food, or they feel that their government doesn't respect them, I feel like that's regardless of whether they have that consent, right? We're going to talk about how rejecting basic premises, or that policies or that parties are allowed to reject basic premises, means that we have the kinds of governments that sleepwalk countries into economic recession. So first of all, we have one claim from Tom. Crazy lies are important, right? So, saying you propose the gold standard is not impossible on our side of the house, but you can't say, I propose the gold standard and it will make everybody rich, right? You have to say, I propose the gold standard for freedom reasons, all by freedom reasons, but no economic reasons, right? Like, so if the Green Party want to make outrageous lies, they can't say, these outrageous lies will make everybody rich, right? Like, that's the basic premise on our side of the house. But on his side, they say, we need signaling, we need people to oppose island gulags. So say, I oppose island gulags, right? I don't need to, like, oppose fractional banking in order to oppose the island gulags. Right? Just say, you can have statements of values, right? I oppose economic elites. I oppose people being able to control opposing fractional banking is the exact signaling that people need in order to understand that you oppose those economic elites. And that wasn't explained and they don't have any more speeches. So, very serious economic consequence, very serious economic crises, or instability in many countries is often caused by a rejection by a party or a politician of some basic facts or a very basic premise. Look at like some different examples. So in Venezuela, this is the denial that printing money has caused inflation, right? Maduro just rejects outright that the fact his government continues to print money is causing 100% inflation. Also notice in Brazil that the government claimed that they wouldn't, that the country wouldn't be harmed by fluctuations in commodity prices. Like, it doesn't matter whether you're a communist economist or whether you're like an orthodox economist. You're saying that, well, if you only export peanuts and the price of peanuts goes down, right, then you're going to be affected by that. So we think that those kinds of basic premises, that's what economic decisions are built on, can't be rejected by politicians anymore. But what happens when, so why do we think they're more likely to accept this basic premise? So first of all, you not having those economic policies in your manifesto puts you at a very serious competitive disadvantage to other parties. So you want to be able to compete at the same level of them. So you're much more likely to accept the basic premise that perhaps Greece does require some debt restructuring, right? And you can't just reject that outright. No thank you. But permitting politicians to reject those premises, to say that you can reject that idea, to say that it's not even, like, it doesn't even exist, right? Often sleepwalks these countries into recession, right? Saying recession will never happen, it'll never happen, and then it comes, right? So notice their side relies exclusively on politicians being able to roll out those experts themselves, while ours removes that policy from the outset or prevents those politicians from rejecting it. So what are the harms of that rejection, right? Why is this very important? So this is massive economic mismanagement on an untold scale. This means the lights don't stay on, food isn't on the shelf. It leads to crushing poverty in favelas, right? And this is what a government does when it says this won't cause inflation, or it says we won't be affected by commodity prices, or we don't need debt restructuring. It makes people poorer, and that's the kind of thing we want to prevent politicians doing. This policy means that certain basic premises are accepted by all parties, meaning that the reaction to a recession is not to make things worse. So Tom wants countries to make decisions based exclusively on what that country wants. But notice what the problem with this is, right? So the idea that experts won't be imposing economic policies on their side of the house is non-comparative, right? On their side of the house, when Syriza rejects basic economic claims, like that Greece needs to fix its tax base, those policies are imposed by outside experts. No country is 100% independent of outside economic forces or outside economic control. So in Greece, the ECB and the IMF do that, right? They impose the kind of economic circumstances that require that. That means that there's no possible world in which you can propose an economic model that is put like 100% in line with what your citizens want without some extra circumstances being opposed on the outside. Why is this worse when it's opposed from the outside as opposed to accepted internally in the country? One, it reduces the standards of living of citizens when they're subjected to sudden economic shocks and the government was not prepared or rejects that that shock is happening at all. Two, it erodes political and democratic will, meaning that citizens have less faith in the premise of their government. Like in the premise that when you vote, you elect someone who protects you, right? They're more likely to resort to kinds of community protection, more likely to be more internal in how they vote, but they're less likely to protect other citizens or be willing to participate in a democracy as a whole. It's where we see backsliding in places like South America moving towards authoritarian tendencies. But we think that how politics will be discussed will improve significantly when we get politicians to try and discuss the consequences of economic policies and the trade-offs that involves. If you have something clear this time.
If Syriza had been totally honest with the Greek people, do you think it would have a government able to negotiate with the Troika at all?
Well, first of all, I think if Syriza had been honest, right, I think the Greek people would have been more prepared for the kinds of things that would have happened to them. So when the results of a policy correlates more closely with what you're expecting, you're less likely to react so viciously. So yes, I think Greece might still have had some poor circumstances, but I think Greeks would have been less upset and less poor, crucially. They would have had more protection from their government. But how do we improve how politicians talk about economics in general? So even if politicians try to talk about economic policies in other ways, even if they try to do signaling, etc., right? Now when they try to get around the policy, even if they are doing that they explain that economic policies have social consequences, that there is a trade-off at play, right? and raise interest rates to make higher saving rates. So people who are saving, like pensioners, have more money. But when you raise that, it means people who have loans, like mortgages, now have more to pay, right? So you need to explain that trade-off, right? Why am I benefiting this group at the exclusion of that group? So first of all, we think people are making economic decisions that more crucially reflect what they believe, which we principally stand behind. But we also think you have more trust in your government, you're more willing to participate, you're more willing to act on it, you're more willing to express your opinion when those results correlate more closely with those claims, right? When the results of that economic policy is much clearer in your life and not something you weren't expecting. Like, that's why that's important. But you're also more likely to accept policies that help people but don't hurt you, because the other side can no longer claim it hurts you, right? Conservatives can no longer claim that increasing public spending on the poor is detrimental to the middle class, when it doesn't actually hurt them, and that policy wouldn't be able to propose. You can say this exclusively helps this group and explain why you're trying to help that group. And if it harms another group, you have to explain why that is happening as well. We think explaining economics in terms of trade-offs is much more preferential. Propose the motion.
Parliamentary politics is not the only form of politics. The reason that we like people being able to engage in democracies is not because we think everyone's always right all the time, or even democracies always make the best decisions. The reason we do it is if you don't give people a voice, they resort to anti-parliamentary measures. They resort to going onto the streets. This isn't a theoretical scenario. We just look at what the Golden Dawn does in Greece to see exactly what happens when you shut people out. Because I want to note in this debate, they can't shut out all heterodox policies. They're not banning the media from talking about this. They're not banning lots of people from talking about it. People will still talk about these economic policies. They just won't hear politicians talking about it. That is a really important distinction in this debate. Seeing that, 2 points of extension. Firstly, the nature of the academy, and secondly, how people react to the academy, and then at the end, rebuttal to closing up. The nature of the academy. So in closing up, we're going to be the first ones to ask the question, where do these experts come from? Because it's not a neutral process, the selection of economists. What happens in universities is a process of self-selection. Senior academics hire junior academics in large part because they agree with them. Because and this gets even worse when they implement this policy. Because choosing the chair of economics at Cambridge or Glasgow or wherever in the world now becomes a hugely political decision. It matters who you appoint, because in 5 years that person is likely to be appointed to the board by the government. What that means is things like funding for universities, all the sort of things that are currently very political under the status quo because of the types of policies that they pursue, these things become more politicised. The second thing to note here is classic forces of regulatory capture. So for example, when people sit on, for example, NICE in the UK, which decides which drugs the NHS will use, when they leave that post, they don't go and work for GlaxoSmithKline, telling them exactly what they want. This is the kind of thing that happens. It was the same opinions, it was the same parties who submitted the people that they selected, who liked those opinions in the first place. The thing I want to note here is Opening Government were very clear with the magazine. They said they will make these decisions by consensus. As someone who was once involved in a 2 3/4 hour judging decision, which ended up in a 3-2-2 split, consensus is not always easy. And what consensus usually means is the vast majority of a panel agreeing. So if this panel has 15 people on, and only 3 or 4 of them are anti-austerity, it'd be easy to shout over those people. You might have a long, contentious discussion, it might get really messy, but ultimately the pro-austerity forces win, because that's what happens. They say consensus will happen. They can't just fiat consensus in when it is not a thing that human beings are inclined to do. What that means is you do, the same thing to know on these panels is they will be self-selected. People recommend other people to join them. So in terms of what the Opening Government principles are considered, it assumes that these panels would work perfectly. And what we show you in closing opposition is structural reasons for what happens. But I want to know another thing. And he offered a POI that did not get a sufficient response. Because Michael's like, you can test things in small-scale tests. How would the New Deal be tested in a small-scale test? How would you test the entire monetary policy, like 100 million or 100 pounds. That's not how economic policy works. That's how physics or chemistry works. What that means is they are very arrogant when they say there's a certain international consensus. They say people like closing the time. The point is they lock in a certain strand of thinking. At the time of colonialism, there are lots of different voices, even if most people were for it or people against it. But they lock in one school of thought. What are the practical implications of this? On to the second point of extension, but firstly, opening government.
Economists of different schools more often than not don't disagree on the empirics per se, but more disagree on what we should value. E.g., Paul Krugman thinks we should value the poor, Milton Friedman thinks we should value the purity of the market. That's not what we're asking them to adjudicate them on, we're just asking them to adjudicate on, is there empirical evidence to support X conclusion from Y?
They literally do disagree on what the empirical evidence says. The New Deal happened 60, 70 years ago. People still do not agree on what caused it, and they disagree about the data in the first place. There was a huge amount of disagreement on the empirical consensus. It is a lie to say economists start from the first principles. There are heterodox Marxists economists out there who just reject the entire premises of these people in the first place. They do not have the same basic principles. That was factually untrue from open government. So secondly, how people react to the economy? Because opening up this place into the hands of Donald Trump and analyse this by doing amusing impersonations of Donald Trump. But 4 reasons this gets worse. Firstly, parties switch to social policy. Because I want to note here, what you say at the moment is that immigrants are economically unproductive. When the panel stops you saying that, they say, oh no, look, there's lots of evidence here that says that immigrants actually increase the GDP of the country. You switch to saying that immigrants are lazy and culturally degrading. You don't stop the message, you switch it to a social form of the message that's actually worse, and it has exactly far-right forces in these countries. The second thing is, and this is really important, you switch to alternate ways of doing politics. Let's look at Syriza versus the Golden Dawn increase. Syriza says there's a certain form of heterodox economics which is being ignored after all anti-austerity politics. This is explicitly what closing government wanted to get rid of it in Spain. They didn't want Syriza to be able to say this. The Golden Dawn says, it's the immigrants' fault, and using a brand of far-right racism. They're not going to get banned, but you ban Syriza in the first place. Usually people who advocate heterodox economic solutions are not the worst parties in these countries. It's the ones advocating the worst kind of social politics. It's even worse than this, because they say politicians are conservative and won't do things. Politicians do not control the memberships of political parties. This is incredibly important, because Golden Dawn is very close to being a neo-Nazi club. Even if their politicians can't say these things, their members suddenly look at them and go, why aren't you saying the things that you were literally saying last year? Why didn't you advocate for these solutions that we know to be true? That's when you go onto the streets, that's when you get violent, when you can't see yourself being represented in a parliamentary system. No thanks. That's when these things get so much worse. The third thing is that when embittered economists get shut out and aren't appointed to these boards, they don't shut up and go away, they go on the media, they talk about the policies. People will still know these alternate policies exist and they'll ask why. The fourth thing is there are non-political ways of protesting. That's not actually a fourth thing, that was the second thing. That's the second thing, but that wasn't bad. So, finally, rebuttal to closing government. Firstly, closing government says that you can't reject basic premises. As I've already noted, politicians can't reject basic premises, but lots of other people can reject basic premises in the media. That means that you can read in the media, this anti-austerity thing will be able to help us, but you can't find anyone on the political stage advocating that. But it's so confusing as a voter when people aren't doing those two things. It's the sort of thing that would lead you to protest and to more violent forms of action. And sometimes you do need to reject basic premises. Austerity was a basic premise for most economists post-2008, and those who were shut out of the UK government time and time again on these supposedly independent boards that they appointed to advise them on economic policy. The second branch of their extension is, look, the ECB and the IMF are going to impose this anyway. This is not a good thing. It is an argument against the ECB and IMF imposing certain things with the democratic wishes of the country. Look, they say, they're less likely to react badly. I just don't know why this is true. They still slash your state services, whether or not you implement this policy. Now they slash your state services, and all the politicians on the national stage are saying this is a good thing, and this is what we have to do is being banned from saying anything else by a board of experts. Ultimately, that extension is about getting what you expect. You can get what you expect and still say we deserve better. They see other people in the media saying you deserve better with these policies they don't see on the stage. That's when you get violence, when you go out and protest in the streets. Very proud of your
Like the previous speaker and call upon the government with
good job, as you'd probably expect from the best speaker in the world, telling us that if politicians and political decisions were made on the basis of more true things, of better evidence, you would get better economic policy as a result. The best response to this, it does come from closing opposition, where they're like, but there is no truth in economics. There are always value judgments, you can dispute even basic premises. Crucially, Bethany has a response to this that is missing from opening government's case, and it's this. On both sides of the house, experts are setting your economic constraints, because recognise, all economics is about balancing trade-offs within a certain series of constraints. Like, there is actually no inherent reason why printing money would have to lead to inflation if everyone would simultaneously agree that it would. Like literally everyone in the world just agree we're not going to change how we value money just because someone else is printing more of it. Crucially, the reason that companies put up their prices when more money is printed, the reason that banks change their policies, and the reason that workers increase their wage demands is because they're told to by experts. Because the same experts who make economic forecasts, sitting in Goldman Sachs, sitting in the ECB, sitting in international markets, are the ones who are still setting these constraints. So crucially, the constraints have to come in one of two ways. Either we impose them internally, saying you cannot put forward claims such as saying that printing money doesn't cause inflation, or they're enforced externally in ways which are far more harmful. They're enforced externally by the fact that people won't buy your produce and won't invest in your country because your currency's been so eroded beyond all reasonable belief. They're enforced in the sense that your people aren't able to buy food, aren't able to keep the lights on in their house. Recognise this form of enforcement of these constraints is far, far, far more harmful than even taking off at their very best slight harms to discursive and political benefits. I'm going to talk about a couple of things here. I'm going to deal with responses to the extension that we've just heard, and no thank you. Then I'm going to go through the claims made by opening opposition in order and deal with them one by one. So, first of all, on the idea that parties will switch to talking about social policy, they can't talk about economic policy. I mean, we already have the answer. They can still talk about economic policy. They just can't claim very specific policy things. I think Bethany does do a reasonable job of telling you they can just make statements of values. But recognise, like, I can try to figure out why that's illegitimate, right? If you as a voter want to vote for tighter immigration constraints on the basis that you think your country should be composed of people who speak the same language, on the basis that you have certain values that should be promoted in your society, I'm not clear why that's not a legitimate means on which to cast your vote. Second, the idea that this makes street movements worse. I mean, I see what Jamie is getting at here. I just don't think the analysis works, because in order for this analysis to work, crucially, a Golden Dawn member would have to care so much about the details of the economic policy they're proposing, such that when their leader wasn't able to see it on TV, then it became a disconnect from their leader, street movements, violence, yada, yada, yada. I don't think Golden Dawn members of street movements care about the details of the economic policy. It's the principles that inspire activists and people, and crucially, the principles are what can remain on our side of the house. The idea that people in the media will still talk about economic policies, even if politicians aren't, I just don't think this is true. I don't think there is particularly much discussion in the media of economics independent of its effect on the political sphere and independent of what's politically possible. Just for the simple reason that most people don't understand it, and it's just not particularly useful, and it's not particularly useful to them. Politics is a crucial signalling role in terms of what is likely to be discussed on TV. So crucially, if an economic policy is completely imaginary, it is like literally impossible that it could ever be implemented. You're probably not likely to discuss it. We get the objection that maybe these panels will have difficulty coming to consensus. I think there's a number of mechanistic things you can do about this. You can say, for example, maybe if like a third of the panel think that something is possible, you can have that in there. You can like mandate that they follow very broad criteria. So I don't think that's a particular problem. The greater problem is the idea of ideological capture. So a specific ideology may capture these panels. A few responses to this. Again, there's a variety of mechanisms you can do. You can mandate, for example, diversity of opinion, diversity of gender and various races, as we can do with things like selection boards and stuff like the BBC or other state-run institutions. Secondly, academic challenge is a very good means of applying scrutiny to these boards. Right? The fact that like academics constantly criticise each other's work, and they have a very strong incentive to do so, insofar as that's how you make your name. Also, this increases even more, at the point at which this panel is literally limiting what is possible for economic policy. You get the greatest possible scrutiny of that panel that you would ever need. So I think crucially, if it is becoming captured by one unrepresentative idea, I think there's very strong scrutiny and the ability to implement very strong checks on that. But recognise, again, this runs into the problem of, again, this is also answered by Bethany's response of, look, these ideologies, the ideologies that experts come from, are the same ideologies that companies, international actors are all working on. So crucially, again, you're still going to have a certain ideological group of experts imposing these constraints on you. On the idea that, okay, so moving on, looking at opening. So on the idea that the status quo does a good enough job and there's actually no need for this policy, I think this is factually untrue, just by the fact that we've seen Brexit happen in open defiance of certain basic political and economic facts. So I think it is clear that there is a need for this policy. Secondly, the contention that this would wreck debate because compliance would be hard. I point out, first of all, there's no reason why this panel couldn't be consultative, right? You can ask the panel what sort of policies would be accepted, where they rejected, they could give you reasons or ways in which you might want to change it. We could have state funding of things like this. But crucially, crucially, in terms of this might harm sort of like green parties or protest parties. I mean, so what, right? If they don't have economic policies in their book, just because most people who vote for those parties vote so on the basis of the other things that they value, on the basis on environmentalism. On environmentalism, and crucially, these parties aren't the ones who are forming governments, right? Any party which is large enough to form a government will have the capacity to sort of develop these kind of policies. Crucially, these parties, when you vote for them, it's either the protest vote, it's either to get them into a coalition where they can just push forward with certain ideas they do, or just create more discursive space for this in your idea. Probably take over me.
If Ted Cruz's tax policy numbers don't add up, is that a discussion we should have before or after the election?
Probably before? Crucially, we probably want people who know about tax policy and experts having that discussion in advance, right? And in the case where it's like unclear and no one can predict it, like sometimes mistakes will happen still, right? So we would have to find out after. I don't think that's a killer POI, right? So, of the idea that the parties will become vaguer, I point out any governing parties, like mainstream parties, would probably lose a comparative advantage by doing so, right? Like if a Conservative Party had literally no economic policies that it could put forward, it probably wouldn't be able to win an election, given that it couldn't be taken seriously on the economy. The idea that this harms centrist part, So specifically, and additionally, like they say this in fact harms centrist parties because they then lose their comparative advantage over people like Donald Trump. But if Donald Trump wasn't telling outrageous lies, it might be legitimate or at least less harmful to cast your vote for him. So I don't see that as being a particular problem in that case. Lastly, the role in signaling. I will probably have to concede to George that there is a grain of truth in this, insofar as maybe you do need to see a very specific policy in order to signal a very specific thing. I genuinely can't think of an example. He couldn't either beyond stuff that you could just write in the book anyway, saying we oppose violent gulags. So I just think we'll have to weigh that off as significantly less important than every other discursive benefit and every other material harm we're talking about. I actually think this is quite a good idea. I quite like technocrats for all these reasons we proposed.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker and call upon the opposition witness to close the debate.
When Michael Gove said that the public had had enough of experts, he at least did that in a context when experts were engaging the Leave voters in open debate. Imagine the propaganda coup if he could have turned around and said, our economic policies have just been banned by the establishment that wants nothing to do with you. Shutting down debate only fuels that kind of narrative. From closing opposition, we did two things in this debate. First of all, we were the team that told you why the empirical body that is the body that is deciding these empirical questions within economics is intrinsically going to be partisan. We explained the mechanism to which this body would be selected and why that would be damaging not only to this panel but to economics as a whole. But secondly, and crucially, we explained to you why the alienated voters that are at the moment are flocking towards the Donald Trumps of this world don't go away on their side of the house. What happens is they get embroiled either in the kind of social policy debates that we think are so much more concretely harmful to individuals on the ground, or alternatively they turn to protest politics that turns violent and again has greater harm. Three things. Firstly, is this debate about the empirical truth or falsity of economic policies? Secondly, what does this policy do to economics? And finally, what does it do to politics as a whole? Is this debate about the empirical truth or falsity of policy? Like, OG did a good job of trying to pull the wool over everyone's eyes and sound incredibly objective when they say, oh, we're just employing a broad spectrum of economists, more on that later. They're just saying whether something will work or not. I mean, empirical verification of economic policies is highly contentious. They explain to you why this is when they talk about the fact that economics involves weighing up incredibly complex and often irrational human decisions on an incredibly broad scale. There is not going to be consensus on the kinds of empirical outcomes you will get in these policies. We often just don't know about what the outcomes will be, even if we're basing this on the kind of like small-scale studies that Michael No, thank you. The only potentially contentious example they give us is Syriza saying that Greece doesn't need to fix its tax base. Syriza is not disagreeing that Greece has an economic problem. They're providing an alternative way when they say that could be better fixed through things like devaluing the drachma if we exited the European Union. We don't think that's an example of rejecting a fundamental premise. Furthermore, we would contend that people only know that these basic premises are true because we tried them. Before it was if printing loads of money was taken to be a potential source of economic fixing, people often didn't know what printing lots of money would do. Owen explains to you, maybe hypothetically it could have worked. This panel, before monetary policy became more standardised, could have implemented such a policy. We think these are the kind of things that were tried and tested before, so few politicians advocate them. There's no guarantee on their side that this panel wouldn't advocate them in cases of heterodox ideas that haven't been tried before, so they get no benefit from this idea of true premises. Secondly, what does this do to economics? Jamie is the first speaker to explain to you where these experts actually come from. Opening government saying, well, a point of broad range of people is simply not good enough. Jamie explains to you first in the mechanism of regulatory capture, whereby appointing a broad range of people is all well and good enough. When that broad range of people want to go on and hold prestigious positions, often consulting with high fees for political parties, they're going to tell these parties what they want to hear. Secondly, he tells you about the fact that you still have to literally know who these people are, right? They're likely to hold academic professions. They're likely to be the Professor of Economics at Edinburgh, who was appointed on the understanding that he could then go on to promote economics at Edinburgh by being appointed to a high-level board. That's why a couple of problems with what CG say to this. First of all, they say, we can just guarantee diversity through gender diversity and so on. Ultimately, you have to know who these people are, they have to have a CV. Jamie explains to you why you bias economics in favour of a particular kind of discipline. Even if you have loads of black women on this panel, they're probably going to be black women that are handpicked because they represent the establishment. Secondly, they say to you, we can check if this regulatory capture that proposes particular ideological policies. I mean, the point is, these policies are the ideological consensus amongst the economic establishment. That's what Jamie explains to you. You can't just check and see if these policies have been captured, because they're things that most prominent economists would agree on. The problem is you are shutting out the kind of economists... I'll take over in a second. You're shutting out the kind of economists that would broaden our understanding of what economics is. You're shutting out the key, the New Deal advocates, and the people who broaden our understanding of what economics is. Go ahead.
Look, fringe policies will have to be sold in more caveated terms in order to achieve consensus, and this will annoy a number of people. But why is this worth more than mainstream policies, which actually are much more frequently implemented, being based on lies like the US national debt is completely unsustainable and we're heading towards a crisis?
Okay, I'll get onto that right now when I talk about what this does to politics. I think even when you're talking about the kind of policies that might seem on the surface to be contradictory, there is still a problem when you force those kind of politicians talking almost exclusively about social policy or force them into protest politics. Because the point is those people still exist, they can still advocate their opinions outside of the system. Thirdly, what does this do to politics? Opening opposition explained to you why people like Donald Trump still exist, but now make economically vague and unverifiable claims that this body cannot rule. They explain why that's a problem for economic political debate. Jamie explains to you that is not the whole of political debate, and there's a problem at the point at which you then force these people to talk about social policy. This policy is relevant now, because there is a large body of alienated people who feel like economic consensuses, like globalization is a good thing, do not serve them. These people do not go away, and you can appeal to them as a politician by talking about things like immigration, not on an economic ground, but on less verifiable, often more toxic and essentializing grounds, like immigrants are lazy or they do nothing. CG say, these can be legitimate. But the point is, empirically, they are never made in the kind of careful ways that Owen talks about. They are made in the kind of ways that make people's lives concretely worse off, that stereotype and inflame prejudice. This alienated class can also be captured by heterodox economics in a way that they can't on our side and a way they can't on their side. Things like the anti-globalization narrative of Syriza, we think are preferable to Golden Dawn. Being able to outflank them on the left with economic policies is better than leaving them only to the social policies of the far right. Finally, protest politics. I mean, Jamie explains to you, there are some groups talking about these kinds of policies, potentially economists that weren't given the chair of economics at Oxford because of the fact they don't agree with the establishment. All of these people are still going to exist in the media and so on and so forth, and they're now going to have the narrative of our policies have been banned by the establishment. When closing governments say Golden Dawn can still talk about the principles of anti-austerity, the point is it's so much more effective for them to be able to say anti-austerity has been banned, the establishment doesn't want you to hear what we have to say, they're still going to talk on about the principles.